Amir Muhammad is accomplished and noted researcher, author, curator, historian, and lecturer. He's the CEO and executive director of America's Islamic Heritage Museum. His work has gained him international recognition. He is among the foremost historians and researchers of the Islamic experience in the United States, as well as one of the leading activists in creating public awareness of America's rich Islamic history. Mr. Muhammad has lectured and exhibited at Harvard, Stanford, Rutgers, Howard, University of Pittsburgh, University of Indiana, Bloomington, University of Florida, the University of Illinois in Chicago, and a host of other universities and schools across the country. He has provided exhibits to the State Department, the Pentagon, Fulbright students, and a host of other government agencies. His exhibits have been on display at masajid, churches, a few synagogues, and for community groups across the country and overseas to Bermuda and St. Thomas, as well as to Qatar, Nigeria, for the Department of State. I want to thank, on behalf of our Canadian delegation, thank Brother Muhammad for inviting us and for allowing us to take part in this very important occasion. Brother Amir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. First, I want to thank Allah, but I want to thank the Canadian delegation that came to share with this knowledge, share this experience with us. Because a lot has been said, and because of the time factor, there's a lot I'm not going to talk about. But at one point that I do want to bring about, we all read in the Quran about Musa. I'll be pleased with him. He was an immigrant. He immigrated. His mother had a vision and Allah inspired her, and he immigrated. So we heard the stories of many immigrants coming throughout. We heard the stories of many travelers. West Africans was travelers, and they immigrated before we came in, like Joseph. You hear the story of Joseph. He'd been sold into slavery by his brothers out of jealousy and greed and other factors. Western Hemisphere, which is a superpower throughout the world. We've heard them talk about Muslims coming as settlers, coming through the Spanish Inquisition. We find Muslims that came in through what they call the Barbary Coast Wars, or as pirates. We find that Muslims came through the African diaspora and through World War I or World War II, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to be brief. I just want to touch on a couple of very important points that my brothers pointed out. These are some of the books that they talk about America's early history. The Sheikh talked about Ivan Van Sertima. They came before Columbus, Africa's early presidents. He also spoke about Leon Reiner, who really wrote a 3-volume set. And Barry Feld, Saga of America, he talks about the 4 corners of the United States, how they found old caliphic writings and caves. This is a history that's still there, that still exists. I won't cover this point because of the time factor, but these are just, I pointed out some of the pieces that they talked about. This here, the Sheikh talked about, this is Mali. A lot of times, we think Mali is the country today, but Mali was an empire. And this is where many of the West Africans came from during that period. He pointed out about the waterway currents. We see it with the hurricanes. You see it all down throughout South America, Panama, and Central America. I want to just talk about the Spanish Inquisition, what the Sheikh talked about. This is West Africa, this is Spain, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about the Mediterranean. The first country to acknowledge America's freedom and independence was Spain. Out of the first 10, Morocco. Out of the first 10 international peace treaties, 5 was done with Muslim countries. Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Muscat, and Oman. And over here, you should see Asali, Morocco. Asali, Morocco was named after a famous European that was a pirate and converted to Islam. And one of his descendants wound up coming here. This is, you'll find ruins, the Sheikh talked about different ruins and historical parts throughout the Caribbean. This is the fort of the Moors. When you saw the last hurricane came, they talk about the fort of the Moors. This is in San Juan. Old San Juan. Over there, the wall that's facing the ocean, is old Arabic script written on this wall. It still exists today. This is a restaurant downtown Old San Juan. You still have the Turkish script and Turkish tile with Arabic script written on it. This was done in the 1700s. I'm not going to go into the facts about that period, but we know about Estevanico. Many documents in African American history books J. Rogers and them, they call him Negro Stephen or Little Stephen. In other books, they call him Estevanico. In other books, they call him Mustafa. He's credited with discovering Arizona and New Mexico. Came with the Spaniards and wound up going inland. This is a photograph of him. Another group of Muslims that wound up coming here, when they was in Spain, they was known as Moriscos. When they wound up being here, coming to the United States, they came known as Melungeons. This is a painting of 6 different paintings that we found in Natchez, Mississippi. And what they was pointing out, there's 6 of them showing how they made this different complexion. There was the whole concept of this picture of Moriscos in Natchez, Mississippi, how they made them lighter. These are different articles about the Melungeons being up in the Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. There's reports that Elvis Presley's mother was a Melungeon. Abraham Lincoln's mother was a Melungeon. These Melungeons still exist today, all throughout. I heard a brother talk about Kentucky. A lot of them was a part of the Kentucky group. Here, many of us know about Coney Island. You ever heard of Coney Island in New York? Where if you Google it, look it up, they nicknamed it Turk's Island. It was named after Anthony Van Jameson, who was the son of Salih, out of Salih, Morocco. He was part of a pirate. He was the first European to really come onto the Manhattan area. This is two of his descendants today. This is the 11th generation and 12th generation. They're Muslims today. We found a tombstone on this 5th generation with the Tawheed on it. I'll talk a little bit later about these tombstones we found all throughout. The first known Moor in the United States was in 1639. He was named Anthony, the Black Moor. Now there's another group of Moors that live in Delaware. Their descendants still live to today. They married amongst the Nagacoke Indians. There's many different reports about them. There's reports about a group that's in Raleigh, North Carolina, that came with Sir Raleigh, and they wound up being known as the Lasses tribe. They're still throughout North Carolina. So these are different articles that they talk about these Moors. The Moors of Delaware, there's articles as early as 1822. And as late as 1977 that we found out about them. Back in this late 1800s, they went around interviewing indigenous people that they found. These are some of the names of the Guineas of West Virginia and their family names. The Moors, the Melungeons of Virginia and Tennessee, and some of their family names. The Moors of Delaware, some of their family names. The Red Bones out of Louisiana. These are people that have been identified and have Islamic roots and heritage. Some of the descendants today are Muslims. We see them come to the museum and talk about this is their family and their family name. Another misperception that many of us have, we're told by this Western world, that the Africans that they brought here had no culture, no history, no identity. It is false. We had a culture, we had identity. You see the growth of Islam from the 7th century, all up in the 8th century, all up in Spain, North Africa. And it was really the West Africans, after the second wave that came and ruled Spain. A lot of times you see even the whitening of these Muslims, in Spain. They take out the blackness from it, or the African. The Sheikh talked about this, showed this map about the route that they brought us in, but what they don't show you early on, remember the Portuguese came down first. They used to come down the coast and get us. And Mauritania and this end of Morocco is where they brought some of the early slaves all up in this area. They don't identify that. Way down here, this part of West Africa, Islam did not penetrate. It was all up in this region. And they're not really showing that growth and that development of Muslims coming from that period. Some of the tribes that they brought in was your Moors, your Syrians, your Tangerines, your Hausas, your Fulanis, your Wallas, your Mandingos. Some of the different ones that they brought in. Your Temis. And they brought us in different regions to do different things. One of the things you find in American history, besides the 4 waves, you find 3 types of Muslim personalities appear in American history. Either they were scholars, entrepreneurs, or leaders. You had 3 groups of Europeans or Westerners controlling us. The Spaniards, Florida, California, and all that region, Mexico. You had the French in Louisiana, and you had the English, the Dutch, and all this type of English on the East Coast. So the people that come out of the East Coast, the Senegambian people out of Georgia, South Carolina, they call them Geechee, or the Gullah people. The same Senegambian people that they had in Louisiana, they call them Creole people. One of the first Hafiz in the United States. We saw that movie, Black Panther. Some of the words they talk about is Dijalo. Another word they talk about is Fulani. These are our people, our history. The Fulanis are scholars. We heard the Sheikh talk about that earlier. Job Ibn Dijala, because of time, I won't go into the stories, but this is the precursor to GQ magazine in 1734, talking about these Fulanis that they brought in. This is a Fulani in London, and you don't hear their story. You know, that African that was brought, just like we don't hear that African that was in Canada. That history's been whitewashed. But there was a London story. This is where they learned about Africa from Job in 1734. And then this is the book they wrote in 1968, talking about the life of Job Ibn Dijala. A lot of Muslims, this is closer up into the Connecticut area. And American history books, they call him Venture Smith. He told me his name was Bakir Toro. He told him to come from the Dubaka River area. Dubaka River still exists. Dubaka, a lot of West Africans, they take the Aleph off. And it's really Abu Bakr, but they call it Dubaka. He said he come from the Dubaka River area. When he died, he owned over 100 acres of land. He brought his wife freedom, two of his sons freedom. And this is his tombstone that they buried him. In the New England area in the 1700s, they believed in life after death. This is why you see the head and the wings to it as an angel. Here, the law of the land in the United States stated in 1685 that if you was a Moor or a Turk and your country got a relationship with the King of England, you got the right to be free. You can't own slaves, but you got the right to be free. So in 1753, there's two Muslims in South Carolina, in Sumter, South Carolina area. They petitioned the government all in Arabic, and it was a Jewish woman that did the translation for them. And their names were Del Carner and Mahmoud Muhammad. In Sumter, South Carolina, there's a street named after this family, the Condor family. And so the Muslims was able to win their freedom. So you see at the turn of the century, you see Noble Drew Ali and others pick up that same concept, saying that we're Moors and tied to the culture, so they're free. The Sheikh showed in his presentation, this is one of the first Arabic letters found in the United States. It's Al-Fatiha and 4 of the last surahs of the Holy Quran, written in Arabic, but yet with the African dialect. It took them 80 years before they did the translation. They told us we couldn't read and write. No, they didn't understand what we could do on our reading and our writing. Of course, we heard the story about Kunta Kinte, but you don't hear that he was a Muslim. You go back and read the first 26 chapters of the book. You talk about his father's name was Amaro, his mother's name was Benta. Talk about the blessings of Allah. Talk about Ramadan and fasting and his friend Rashid. This here is the actual picture of Chicken George, dressed in a robe that hangs up in Alex Haley's museum. This picture also is on his tombstone, which is buried next to his mother Kizzy and a few others. And in that cemetery, we found tombstones with the Tawheed on it, with the one family. This here is a monument honoring the arrival of Kunta Kinte into Annapolis, Maryland area. So you had Job and Kunta Kinte and a lot of them that came in that area. And at that point, it was tobacco was the king. Later on, it transitioned into wheat and different things. Here's a story. These are some runaway slave advertisements. This is one looking for a brother named Mustafa out of North Carolina. Mustafa had a scheme with his slave owner that he would get sold to another one, escape, get sold to another one, and escape. They made it from North Carolina to Richmond, Virginia. That was their hustle. And then they departed. These are runaways looking for one named Kawami, another one named Sambo, smooth face from the Moorish country, which is Muslim, another Sambo. You learn that a lot of West Africans use the name Sambo as a second name. They identify that as the warrior spirit. If you got children, that second child always want to compete with the oldest and dominate the younger. They identify that as a warrior spirit. This is why you find many Sambos all throughout the United States. This here is a runaway slave advertising looking for a brother named Muhammad in 1774. So we've been part of this American system. Then in 1790, it was a group of 10 Muslims out of that same area, out of Sumter, South Carolina area, Charleston area, petitioned the government for their freedom. This time it was 5 males, 5 females. They petitioned for their freedom and they won. And it became known as the Moor Sun-Dry Act. You know, they had a little melanin in them. You know, look European, but they had a little melanin in them. That's why they called them sun-dry. You know, it was the Moor Sun-Dry Act. Muslims, we found at least 6 people had Islamic names that fought in the Revolutionary War. Yusuf bin Ali became known in American history as Joseph bin Heli. Ben is Ibn, Heli is Ali. You had Babbitt Muhammad, Joseph Sabo, and Francis Sabo. These are 2 postage stamps that they did in the 1970s, honoring these Muslims, but they honored them as revolutionary African-American heroes, not as Muslims. One was Peter Saline, And the other one's Selene poor. If you look in the dictionary, Western Dictionary, they tell you this word, in America they say Salem, but they tell you that root word is Arabic. So we know it's Selene. Here, this is a letter from the Sultan of Morocco to George Washington. And this is George Washington's letter back to the Sultan of Morocco. This is the ratification of that peace treaty. You find John Adams' signature and Thomas Jefferson's signature on it in 1787. Both of them were U.S. diplomats to the Muslim world. I talked earlier about Morocco, and they trying to sign that peace treaty with these Muslim countries so they could have free waterway rights. Many of your Barbary Coast wars was instituted because of that. America didn't want to pay $80,000 for free waterway rights. Which to the point that saber that the Marines have today, that sword that they carried when they conquered Algiers, the Bay of Algiers gave them that sword, and they've been carrying it ever since. That point. This is a copy of the Quran of Thomas Jefferson's, which is a 2-volume set. This is a copy of John Adams' Quran, which is in Massachusetts today. This is one of the articles of the United States. Said it is not founded on Christian religion. You know, we hear that they say America was built upon Judeo-Christian value. We that was born as Christian, we know that is not true. America was built upon the freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And it was very inclusive. You hear these F are really S's with Muslim men. You know, they're saying there was no hatred or any antagonism that they had for Muslims, that they were very inclusive. At the turn of the century, you started finding Muslim personalities appearing. One of the earliest Muslim personalities in this D.C. area is Yara Mahmood. This painting hangs currently right now at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This one hangs in Philadelphia Historical Society. Reports that Yara was famous for swimming. He had a hauling business. He owned property. He was very entrepreneurial. He was very industrious. Bailor Muhammad. This was the first documented Muslim leader in the United States. In the War of 1812, Bailor Muhammad told his slave master, he said, I got 80 men to help defend this island. I can't count on the Christian slaves that you own. So he identified 80 of them. Bailor Muhammad is part of American folklore. If you ever heard of the Uncle Remus stories, Peter Rabbit, Baba Rabbit, it's based upon his son Aaron. This is a 13-page book that he was really, it's a letter, Rasala, that he was writing to the community, trying to remind them how to pray, how to fast, Ramana, best time to dhikr. So there was a little taqwa there was a consciousness there. And out of Bailor. From Bailor, we found, for me, I found very unique. In America, we had like 2 Bailors. We had Salih Bilali and Bailor Muhammad, both on these plantations out of Georgia coast, which they call the Gullah people, those God Allah people, those people that believe in Allah. Up around in the northeast in this area, if you see a lot of African Americans eating rice, they call them Geechee. These are what they're known as Geechee people, but it was the Gullah people. We know a story about Bailor ibn Rabah and Prophet Muhammad Thyself Islam. When he was converted to Islam, his slave master tortured him, left him out in the desert. All he could say was ahad. Then he couldn't do that. Put up the one finger. You know, you see when these sports teams, when they win, we're number one. Well, in between these 2 Bailor, Salih Bilali and Bailor Muhammad, we found this first tombstone with the Tawheed on it. And this is in Georgia Island. We found these tombstones from Florida all the way up to Canada, out west to Kansas. This is the actual copy of the book, page from the book that we had on display a couple of years ago at the Smithsonian. This is the story of Salih Bilali. The stories Toni Morrison writes about them, Tar Baker's Songs of Solomon, Jim Brown come from this, Cicely Tyson come from there. There's a movie called Daughters of the Dust. There's so many different stories that about these Gullah people. Because of time, I'm trying to speed. Now that was in 1812. Now this is 1847, 1857. They're still enslaved, but you see them with Islamic names. You see Ishmael, you see Bilal, you see Fatima. This Bakir is probably Bakir. Billy is probably Bilal, Fatima, Muhammad, Abena. You see them still maintaining, giving them Islamic names. We interviewed some of the descendants. They said that later on, at the turn of the century, they were still giving them Islamic names, but as nicknames. They wasn't giving them names, Islamic names, while they were enslaved. And here's another Muhammad, of Suleiman, of another Fatima. So you see, Fatima was very popular. Aminata was very popular. I'll talk about her in a minute. We talk about the Gullah people. Now, this is one of the most recent findings that we found. I was talking with Sister Aisha Prime, and she said she come from that Jacksonville area, Kingston Plantation. So I started looking at Kingston Plantation. This is a photograph. You see this brother in the kufi. You see him in an African garb, man. You know, and this is in the 1800s on the plantation. You know, these are what they call the Gullah people. I mean, that's clear. You know, a lot of pictures you may see the sisters with the scarves, but very few of the early pictures see brothers with kufis on. All right, and then we talk. This is a story about the women. There's a book that's called the Writers Project went around interviewing some of the descendants called Drums and Shadows. Interviewing them, how they remember how they used to pray 3 times a day, saying I mean, or saying Assalamu alaikum. You see the sisters still wearing their scarves and their garbs. You see some movies that they built some of the first forms of houses out of sand, seashells, and limestone. They're called tabbies. These rooms still exist today. This was the first hospital that was built. If you watch that movie Glory, it showed this hospital during that period and that time. All right, this is a house that they call the Morris House. This is on Bay Street in Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, early period at that time. You'll find an Islamic architect, a brother in one of his questions, talk about there was a church in South. Well, this is that church, the first African Baptist church. On the second floor, all those pews got this Arabic script written on it, done in the African dialect. Years ago, they used to call it, the creator, they used to call it African scribble scrap. It wasn't until years later that they came aware what this writing was all about. Of course, the Prince among Slaves, Abdul Rahman. I'm going to elaborate on him. This is he came out of Timbuktu. This is a letter that he wrote in 1828. This is one reason why we celebrate October, as Canada does all throughout the country. But in the DC area, we celebrate October as Islamic Heritage Month. One of the reasons based upon his writings, it was done in October 1828. Talking about, my name is Abdul Rahman. I was born in the city of Timbuktu. I lived there till I was 5 years old. Then I moved to the country, Futu Jawa. I lived in the capital, Timbuktu. Then you're talking about how he got enslaved and captured and wound up in Natchez, Mississippi. That letter's in Yale, University of Yale. This one is in Philadelphia. This was written also in 1828. When he got his freedom, he went up and down the East Coast and out Cincinnati or Cleveland to get his freedom. You had, and the Imam alluded to earlier about the cinemas. You had the cinemas that was down in the Florida area. This is where I have a problem with, one of the problems I have with Trump. If you watch Trump, a lot of times you have Andrew Jackson in the background. Andrew Jackson was a hater of us. He started the Gullah Indian Wars. These cinemas had 2 forts, one Fort Musa and one Fort Negro. And when we say fort, we might get that cowboy Indian picture. No, these was gated communities. But these people had owned land, farmland. It was productive. And they didn't like this. And so many people ran down from out of being enslaved into this Florida area. And this is what stimulated that Andrew Jackson and some of these wars. That's why I have a problem with this Trump when he comes up with that picture behind. Back at the 1912, they're still wearing their fezzes. Some of them were still living out in the bush. This is a photograph of one of the oldest ones during that period of time, the oldest tribe member. Now, when we come to Harriet Tubman, if you go back and look at Harriet Tubman, you know, they call her Harriet Tubman. They say that she was born with the name Amir, which is Amina. And you see this story with a Canadian and American intersection of a story is that during the war with the British, Bilal, man, talked about Bilal earlier, he told the British that I will fight with you. Told the slave master I would defend this island against the British. But the British had a scheme that, look, if you join us, fight with us, you get your freedom. This is how they wound up going to Nova Scotia. Salih Bilali descendants fought with them, and they wound up going to Nova Scotia. And in Bridgetown, and you find there was a movie that was done a couple of years ago, The Book of the Negroes. And it was done by Aminata. This is Amina. And she wrote and identified, taking down some of these names. And in Bridgewood or Bridgetown in Nova Scotia, we found tombstones in that cemetery with the Tawhid on it, with the one finger on it. Harriet Tubman, you know, my ancestor that was born around that was enslaved around Harriet Tubman time, her name was Hagar. Harriet is the European name. So, we didn't speak good English, proper English, so I believe that this Harriet was Hagar, if she took on her mother's name. If she moved her name from Aminata to Hagar, to Harriet, we call her Harriet. And she said that she used to fast every Friday. Every Friday. She was a believer. She said that she moved on the inspiration of God. She waited for the inspiration of God. That's how she moved on. And back in the days, we used to make du'as like this. And you see Harriet, she always had a scarf on. Here, this is in what they call the Eastern Shore of Maryland. The brother brought out another point about churches. You got in St. Mary, what they call Southern Maryland, that was heavily Catholic, controlled by Catholics, very oppressive. On the Eastern Shore, the Catholics moved out, and the Quakers and the Methodists came in. And this is why you find many of your Africans, the first African Methodist church came about. Because the Methodists recognized if you got a spirit and soul with God, you have a relationship with God. Catholics believe other than that. So you find some of the first churches. You see the minarets. You see the Islamic architect all throughout. Now, they call it, in the research, they call it Gothic. There's nothing Gothic in there. I alluded to gargoyles and all of that. There's nothing Gothic there. This is purely Islam. They come from West Africa. They know what a masjid looks like. And tell you the truth, after seeing them calling the Gothic, I went and investigated the Gothics. They was really first Muslims, and they kind of conquered them, and then that's when they threw all the gargoyles and everything off their what they call churches to death. Here's another church. They changed the windows. New modern windows. But right here, they made an Islamic architect. They cut it out so you can still keep that frame in the window. This is their tradition that they had. Brother that was with me said that all the churches was facing east. These are U.S. Census records. This is in Ohio. Here's a brother named Henry Allah coming from Ireland. I found about 7 different people coming from Ireland. So now I go to Sheikh Google, Muslims in Ireland. So 1959, I said, it can't be. I seen this. Muslim pirates, Moors, conquered the southern parts of Ireland, and many of them converted to Islam. So now I went about this Odu, Otus, all these different forms. Remember, when the Irish came in this Western Hemisphere, they treated them like us. They was right next to us. Here's another one in California. His name is Muhammad, age 28, coming from Arabia, living in California. That's 15 years before we got our freedom. Another famous Muslim personality is Omar ibn Said. He's one of the most prolific writers in the States. He would use amulets, symbols in his writings. He wrote one of the few that wrote his own autobiography. Matter of fact, his autobiography now is at the Library of Congress. A Muslim that owned it, and the Library of Congress brought it, so now it's on display. This is some of the pages from it. And this is a Bible that they gave them all in Arabic, and it was in Lebanese script, this Bible. This is at Davidson College today. This here is the first Muhammad family that we find recorded and documented in the United States as free people in 1850, living in Frederick, Maryland. There's a family named Muhammad. Some of them moved out to Baltimore. If you ever heard the terms of the vendors vending in Baltimore, they call them the Arabs. They nicknamed them after these Muhammad family that was vendors or peddlers that they called them. This is a tombstone of Jeremiah Muhammad, his 6th generation family, and his death notice. They maintained this name up to, I would say, about 2000. We went out to research and we just missed the family that moved from the townhouse to out of the city. One of them had moved to Nebraska, had a cake mix called Omar Cake Mix. Matter of fact, descendants from this family are the Gregory family, Francis Gregory family, the first African-American astronaut is from this family. This is the first Islamic design house in the United States, done in 1848. You ever heard of P.T. Barnum Bella Circus? Well, he modeled this house as the Royal Pavilion in India. It burnt down in 1857. But this here is the current museum that's there. And as a child, when I grew up in this town, this was the skating rink called the mosque. So all throughout the United States, you're going to find Islamic architects and designs. Somebody talked about Nicholas Said making it all the way up to Canada, but he also wound up in Tennessee. There's layers of stories within these stories that can be motivating, stimulating to many people of all faiths, of all culture. Because of time, I won't. Here's another one named Max Hassan, United States Colored Troop. Came directly from Africa, worked as a porter. We found his census records of his descendants moving into New York, being in New York. And these are some of his military records. Identifying him. This is a Quran that was saved during the Civil War. In Tuscaloosa, Alabama, this Quran still exists today. The Union troops went down to burn down the town. The librarian said, can we save some books? Can we save some books? He said, no, you can save one book. That one book he saved is this Quran, which still exists today in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You know, in America, you know, I grew up watching cowboys and Indians, you know. Muslims was not cowboys in America. There was camel boys. The United States government used them to go out west as camel herders. One of the ones is Hajj Ali. And they nicknamed him Hajj Ali. He died in Quartz, Arizona. They put a pyramid on him and a camel on top. There's an old cowboy picture showing him how to go out Southwestern Trail. They got 3 actors acting like Arabs coming out of Sajda. They call one Hajj Ali. Come on, Hajj Ali. These are some of the tombstones we found all throughout the United States with the Tayyid on it. This one got the name Usman Rahman. Rahman is spelled R-O-C-K-M-A-N. These are Memphis, Tennessee. All around, we see them with these tombstones saying, no matter what you did. And at first, I thought it was just uniquely to African descendants of African Americans. So I went to this town called Mecca, Indiana. In Mecca, Indiana, we found these Arabic tombstones. This is the wife of a noble Sharif who died in 1917. From Mecca, Indiana, to Terre Haute, Indiana, to Bloomington, Indiana, to the University of Bloomington, Indiana, we found tombstones in 7 different cemeteries with the Tayyid on it. And the first president of University of Indiana in Bloomington, his wife had the tombstone with the Tayyid on it. These are tombstones we found in Maine. He died in 1906. That's 113 years ago. Go back where? 113 years ago. Here's another one, Qasim Salih Belowski. Now we know what region he comes from. It's still Bilal, but it's down Belowski. You see, some Africans would do Bilal, Bilali. You know, you find the different spellings. In America, in World War I, there was 550 people that had the last name Muhammad, spelled 41 different ways. M-O-M-U-M-A, H-A-H-O, 2 M's, 1 M, E-D-I-T, 41 different ways if you can spell the name Muhammad. So I'm not amazed at it. Now there's another group of people that were called the Ben Ishmael tribe, or the people of the Peri. The first reports that they established these towns, Muhammad, Morocco, Illinois, and Mecca, Indiana. And they used to make annual journeys into Annapolis, Maryland, until they pushed them out. And they wound up, and they were the first group of people, that, in fact, this is where Hitler learned to use genetics to get rid of people. They pushed them out, they wound up going to Chicago and the Detroit area, to the point that when Noble Drew Ali moved his organization from New Jersey to Chicago and Detroit area, he said these people was more receptive to Islam. Some of his early followers and some of the early followers of Farad was these Ben Ishmael people. This is that town, Mecca, Indiana. One of the cemeteries called Arabian Cemetery. We found tombstones with Tayyid on it. It has one of the few covered bridges throughout the United States. This is a town called Muhammad, Illinois. There's reports that Abraham Lincoln spent the night in this town. They don't want this name in this town, but they could not. They tried to change it to Middletown, but they had to go back because there's a town in Illinois with the name Middletown. And just right outside of Urbana, you see the highway sign Muhammad. These are tombstones you may not see with the Tayyid on it. And in this library, I said reports that Abraham Lincoln spent the night. In this library, we found that there was another town called Muhammad, Texas. And this is found by a camel herder. They had a post office from 1857 to 1916, led by August Muhammad, who was also one of the Arabian camel herders. They brought 3 of them in, and they brought 75 camels all from around the Muslim world to go out west. And these are some of the towns that are listed all throughout the United States with Islamic names. 29 Lebanon, 19 Cairo, 17 Egypt, 13 Jordan, Medina, Palestine, Damascus, Mecca. Somebody had to know about Islam. They call it Mena. There's no question. Alhambra. You see the different names in there. You even got some of the African names. Africa, Darfur, Dahomey, El Qadir is in Iowa, named after a famous Muslim from Algiers who moved to Lebanon that saved some Christians in Lebanon. President Buchanan gave him some guns, and they honored this town. I watched Cowboys in India, watching Gunsmoke. There's about 7 episodes that he wanted to go to this town called Al Qadir. You know, so it's all around. I just wanted to point out, these are some of the tombstones we found in Canada. You know, this is really, like I said, this is more inland, but then there's some we found in Nova Scotia, all throughout. The brother talked earlier about Muhammad in Canada. Now, in America, they show this brother as a wild man. If y'all ever been to the African American Museum, when you first go downstairs, the first, you got the Arabic on the wall, but then you got a little picture of Job. They don't tell us that he could read and write, was educated. They allowed us to still perpetrate. Then you walk down, there's this Muhammad looking like a wild man. Like they had to civilize him. It wasn't until I went to Canada, found out he was in Canada and came up was a scholar. Thank you, Yasin. You know, really, Allah says, travel throughout the earth and see what's before you. You know, we got to tell our story. If we don't tell our story, who will? This is the first European-American Muslim. He was a U.S. diplomat and a journalist, Alexander Russell Webb, wound up in the New York area. Here, these are Polish Tartars. One of the, you know, I thank the Imam. He talked earlier about the confusion about the different masjids, the establishment of them, okay? But on timeline, this is the first masjid after the Africans, which has not been documented, the house of prayers and all those places of worship. But this is the Albanian masjid, Polish Tartar masjid in New York, established since 1907. They still use it today. Out of these Polish Tartars. One of the Polish Tartars that we're aware of is Charles Bronson, is a descendant of the Polish Tartars. This here is Afghanistan in Portland, Oregon, getting its citizenship in 1913. Coming over in 1911, getting its citizenship in 1913. That's over 106 years ago. We're part of American fabric. Don't go for the okie-doke. We've been here in all aspects. These are Turkish immigration. You know, I like to say the story of Musa. We had to see the Quran as something real for us. I talked earlier about Noble Jali. These are people that came with pseudo Islam or Islamic ideas, concepts. It wasn't pure Islam. It was like that first seed, the revitalization coming back. A lot of times we get stuck on what we see at that seed, but don't understand the evolution of it. You know, and each one of these groups, from the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, and the Akhendians, you find the growth and the development from Shirk or whatever path they was on, and they found al-Islam. Muhammad Dusi Ali, he was a Renaissance man, like Paul Robeson. He was a diplomat. You ever heard of Marcus Garvey, one guy, one aim, one purpose? He got it from him. He worked for him when he was in London. This is when they dedicated the masjid, the first one built from the ground up in the United States. This was done in 1921 in Detroit, but because it was more Ahmadiyya influence, Muhammad Sadiq dedicated this masjid. And if you hear about the Ford plant, Ford factory, this is that masjid that was there. Not this one. This one is in their headquarters in Silver Spring. But there was the first masjid. This is the first masjid built from the ground up. But in 1926, they knocked it down. But you don't hear reports about it. You hear more reports about the Ross, North Dakota one, which was established in 1929. And this is when Farad Muhammad got arrested and the FBI people was questioning him. Why I brought this up is I wanted to bring up this point. You know, there's so many different debates, a lot of confusion. But this, when he got arrested, this is Wali Farad. They said he come from Afghanistan. Okay, come with the right date, February the 26th, 1893. Now, there's reports that Noble Jali selected him to be part of his group, but Lomax Bey and the other leaders didn't agree. He was too young, and then he wound up going to Detroit and started what he called Islamic. I don't even want to call it. We wound up becoming the Nation of Islam, but I think it was Islamic Temple of Islam. But he was an immigrant, and then if you look at the police report, it says that when they got arrested, like what happened, this house right here, if you Google the voodoo cult, the voodoo house, this is the house that guy that did the lynching, the first sacrifice, ended This is the house, and this is where all the stories started coming out. When the FBI and everybody came and raided them. It was out of this house, and this guy named was Robert Harris on there. And tell you the truth, Elijah Muhammad's father lived on this street, down the block, a couple blocks. And later on, Elijah lived up the street. But not the same years, but around that time. Here, we all know about Malcolm Shabazz. But here, this is the first Shabazz in the record, census record, 1900s. His name was Hassan Shabazz, in Chicago, coming from Persia. 1810, this is 1810. Now he got a family living in the Chicago area. Then 1820, he moved to Milwaukee. The first three temples of the Nation of Islam, Chicago, Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee. So I wondered that, and then they always say we're the tribe of Shabazz. I wondered if this was a friend of Farad, and there was some relationship there. We know about the story about Elijah Muhammad. Really, he was really a reformer. He gave us Islamic ideas. I was in Canada. And the guy kept pressing me. He said, when y'all get the Quran? When y'all get the Quran? Well, we had it in the 50s, 60s, but we had it on the shelves. We didn't apply it to 1975. And then he said, well, in India, we didn't get it to 1,000 years. We had the fiqh and sunnah. I thought about it. Wait a minute. Elijah said, I'm not here to teach you a religion. I'm here to clean you up. The one that's going to come after me is going to teach you religion. So we had fiqh, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat. No, we had the moral concept. Not to say we all followed it, but he gave us that principle and told us the one we were going to come after. So these are some of the base. So I'm saying, to look at the story, you got to look at the American story not as an ugly story, or not as we see Islam supposed to be as it is today. We see it as an evolution and as a growth. One thing that they did in that community, which we got to learn to do, brothers say engage, get involved. They provided inner city jobs. They brought in fish. They brought in the paper and other things, sardines, and even today, the bean pie is as American as the apple pie. Anywhere in the world, people come running, I want that bean pie. Three things they love: Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, that bean pie. Then Martin Luther King. But that's it. Now, this is Imam Ezzeddin. He was one of the first Sunni Muslims to take on an organization. Muhammad Ezzeddin really was the first one to take Hijra. When the police stuff went on with Noble Drali and the shooting went on, Muhammad Ezzeddin was known as Nomex Bey. He wound up going to Turkey. This is in the 1930s. Then it didn't work out for him in his community in Turkey. He wound up going to in Egypt. Coming a scholar and coming back, establishing communities. Another one was Wali Akram. And here's another one, Sufi Muhammad. He was Abdullah Suleiman, teaching. This is in the 1930s in New York. There's another one, Sufi Abdul Hamid, that they're talking about. So you had different Muslims that was talking to Sunnah all throughout. This transition appeared. And this is another unique one I found. Hajj Ishmael Salmon, he said he made Hajj in 1941. But he had the name Shabazz. He said, I come from the tribe of Shabazz, being a Haji. And then he talked about Al-Islam. For me, that terminology didn't get reintroduced into the 2000s. What did Imam say? Al-Islam. These are Al-Sunni Muslims. This is Ezzeddin and Al-Sunni Muslims in 1947, 45, as Canada was getting it together. Their organization. So I would say, my brother, in the Western Hemisphere, this should be one of the first. 1945, 47. In Canada, we get it to them. Sheikh Dawood, State Street Masjid, and his wife Khadija, really, Islamic Relief, which we know today, but in Red Crescent, these are some of the things that they started. Dawah into the community and service in the community. The Albanian community is one of the first imams, their headquarters. Some of the tombstones, here's Ali Muhammad, 1915. He passed. That's 100 and some odd years ago. Passing, so we've been here, And then you got Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids is the longest standing masjid. It is known as the Mother Mosque. It was established in 1934, and it still exists today more as a museum. If you eat breakfast food, the minimum meat comes from this community. And as the brother pointed out, you saw the transition when they first came, they tried to merge in society. Then they got backbone and started coming towards the deen. Atlantic Records. Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, all that was established by this Muslim brother, Ahmed. His father was the ambassador for Turkey. You know, he started Atlantic Records. Of course, we know Muhammad, the American hero. You know, Malcolm X, here's a postage stamp about. These are people that the world look at, the world model at, that it represents the ability that we can change. Malcolm engaged in all aspects of society. They didn't support civil rights, they fought for human rights, human dignity. And this is what we have to stand up for today, to serve the community and fight for human rights. Did we talk back then days, well, freedom, justice, and equality. Everybody needs to be free, everybody needs justice, and we all need to be treated equal. You know, now they hated Muhammad Ali, now he's an American hero. He stood up for his principles, so hold on to your principles. No matter how hard it may be, hold on, eventually you win through. Allah tells us that. You know, and here he was an Olympic hero, man. They hated him. I remember them, they hated this man. But now he's an American hero all around the world. And Canada again. I ran into a young man, his name is Muhammad Ali. Named after Muhammad Ali. So we got to understand the influence that we bring upon people and start applying it in a very positive way. Then you had the transition of Imam Muhammad coming in with concepts and bringing us towards the Sunnah. You know, just like the Prophet Muhammad taught Islam, we had to change our Qibla. The Muslims in America we had to change our Qibla. We was in Shirk, we was in Darlene, we were doing everything. We had to change our Qibla and pick up the Quran and apply it and follow it. Where we are today, engaging in American society. And the other Imams, Imam Ezzeddin, who buried Malcolm, and Sister Betty Shabazz, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, Imam Yahya. These are all brothers, are pioneers out of our American history. Here, these look like masjids. None of these are masjids. These are masons. This is a Shrine of Temple in New Bern, North Carolina. This is the, not the Dome of the Rock, this is St. Jude Hospital. This is a pyramid. This used to call a mosque in Richmond, the brothers made them stop. And now it's called a culture center. So Islamic influence is all throughout. Even in one of the problems that we have in the Caribbean is that you have the Dutch, so many colonial powers ruled that our story got lost. Where like you see the Islamic architect, you know, but the Dutch took it first. After the Spaniards, and then after the Dutch, you got Spanish, you got other people. So that Islamic component, that story is lost. It's not there. It's us that we got to learn to tell that story. May Allah increase our faith, increase our taqwa, increase our consciousness.